Our next speaker is Mark Joyner. Until recently, Mark was the CFO and Executive Director of the National Australia Bank and is now Chair of JB Were. He's a thoughtful leader in this area, and today he will be providing his perspective on how these issues are being impacting the finance industry. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. You've seen my whole presentation. I no longer have access to the technology to compete with Tony. He has wonderful slides. And Ben did ask me to talk about the issues of sustainability from the point of view of the finance industry, but I'm not going to do that. And now that I'm up here, there's not a lot he can do about it. So since I have stepped down from the bank, I have a bit more time to dig into the sustainability issues, so I thought I would just give you an update on how I'm starting to see these issues, and perhaps that'll broaden the debate a little bit. Although I must say, it's one of the few conferences I've been to where I agree with just about everything that's been said to this point. So this is a sculpture by a fellow called, if I get my phone to remind me, Isaac Cordell. And it's currently in Berlin, and it's entitled "Politicians Discussing Climate Change." And the sad thing is that if he actually did one of boards of directors, they wouldn't even be having a discussion at all. And so what I am learning as I dig more into these issues is, as I've spent time with climate scientists, that we've already locked in a lot of change. We've already locked in a couple of degrees of temperature change and probably 2 meters of sea rise. Unfortunately, the systems that deliver that to us are quite slow systems, so we don't see it, and therefore we don't really react to it, or we have the ability to not only externalise the data, but externalise the experiences of one-off events or the like. Secondly, starting to see some worrying new lines of argument emerging around how our brains are wired, in particular ways, going back to the hunter-gatherer, not to really face into issues like this. I mean, hunter-gatherers didn't worry about things that were going to happen in 80 years' time and were bigger than a woolly mammoth and therefore beyond contemplation. So, humanity's not completely at sea on this. I think there are a number of people who wouldn't be in this room that do get it, but the majority of people don't get it, and it's partly the way we're wired. So it goes to how powerful the communication needs to be if you want to get traction with people. The other thing is starting to read more and more about is paralleling our civilization and its progress with civilizations that have failed in the past. People are starting to take seriously the possibility that this civilization might merely go over the cliff. It's considered a black swan event, low probability, high consequence, of course. But I think the probability rises all the time. The other thing that strikes me, and it's coming back to Australia in particular, and it goes to a little of what Jeff was saying and Tony, is the lack of a progressive attitude in Australia. And Australia, not only in a relative sense, is not progressive, but is becoming less and less progressive on these issues. Now, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter what Australia does, because it's basically what happens in China that's going to move the needle, and you can understand perhaps why people are opportunistic in trying to maximise wealth and standard of living in the meantime, and that's, I think, giving them a break. I actually believe that as an advanced economy, we have a responsibility to do our bit and to set a good example, frankly. And so I don't excuse that. I volunteered stupidly to teach for 3 days at a deep dive sustainability conference, and I was actually a bit embarrassed. It was Australian and New Zealand representatives. There was a smattering of probably mid-level people from Australian corporations. New Zealand turned up with a senior public servant, 2 leaders of business forums, and senior representatives from the 5 biggest businesses in New Zealand. And they'd done a lot of work together before they came. And I was just embarrassed for Australia that we're in such a high state on the debate. So in all these cycles, there's always a progressive element and an an element that favours the status quo. And in a big company, you have to be very careful about being too progressive. Because if you don't get your timing just right, you're going to look like the back end of the horse. On the other hand, the mode that most businesses get themselves into is living with the assumption that the status quo is going to exist forever. And I was at the TED conference. I go to a lot of places. I was at a TED conference in Vancouver. Everybody should do that. It's a wonderful life experience if you get the opportunity. And Larry Page was there. He's the CEO of Google. And really important people at TED conferences don't prepare presentations, they get interviewed. And Larry was interviewed by Chris Anderson at the end. He said, Chris said, Larry, what's your one big takeaway, your one insight, your one bit of career advice for everybody in the room? What's your one thought? And Larry said, big companies fail to anticipate the future. And that's really what happens. You get in a big company and a lot of the thinking is straight line thinking. And so often that means that industries, the same as civilizations, come to the fore and then they fall away. Just ask Kodak about digital camera technology. Ask the car industry about being established in Australia. Ask Maya, which even 2 years ago didn't have an internet site that you could buy anything. Right? These companies have failed to anticipate the future. So Australia is clearly not on a progressive path. BHP announced some prospective huge new coal mine, I think yesterday. We're investing heavily in port capacity. We have an electricity distribution system that we've invested $35 billion in improving the capacity and certainty of over recent years. Contrast that with an example, one of those companies that turned up at the deep dive I mentioned, a New Zealand energy company, that's all over the concept of battery technology. How can you make the car part of the house? How can you fund customers to make the transition? They want to convert their incumbency into an incumbency in the new world. And I would characterise most energy companies in Australia as being in denial. But we've seen that the political class fails, and we understand why it will fail. But Australian business really needs to become more of a force and start to demand that policies are shaped in a way that moves us in the right direction. And if Tony hadn't mentioned Aldersgate, I would have mentioned Aldersgate. Because I think in the UK, in New Zealand, in Canada, there are business groups that are proactive in developing policy that gets the country moving and industry moving in the right direction, that they then sell to all sides of politics to try and turn into apolitical solutions. And if you go on the websites of these organisations, you'll see congratulations coming in all directions from those. And then there's innovation, which is the one thing which might make all of this go away if we get really, really lucky. And Australia is really not holding its own on innovation either. What we spend relative to even China as a developing economy, in absolute, certainly, as well as in relative terms, is poor, and the incentives are being pulled back, not pushed forward. And yet, ironically, Australia in a new energy world might have competitive advantages. So we see today the aluminium industry threatening to pull out of Australia, but in a solar world, they're becoming back. And so we should be trying to bring on this transition, investing to do that instead of defending the dinosaur industries. So I think there's a gap in the Australian forums that allow a progressive voice of Australian business to come forward. I know, Ben, that's what you're trying to do essentially, but it's not a force at the moment. I spoke to a senior public servant in Australia recently, who I know shares an interest in these topics, and I said, you should help me identify the top 10 people in Australian business who really get this, and we'll bring them together and perhaps we can get a more progressive voice going. And he said, I'd be very happy to do that, but I must tell you, there aren't more than 10. And that's how bad it is, frankly. So then let me tell you what else I've learned, and this is sort of trying to broaden the debate a little bit more. And that was when I was at this deep dive conference. It was being run by Cambridge University, and they're all much smarter than me. And but as you know, this can become a very confusing topic: water use, land use, biodiversity, nitrogen cycle, temperature. You know. So at the end of day 2, I was sitting down with a guy from Cambridge, and I said to him, I have a burning desire to simplify what you're saying and try and capture it on one page, because I don't think it needs to be this complicated. And he said, oh, you want it on one page? Oh, hang on a minute, hang on. And he got up and he went off, and I thought, well, fantastic, I'm going to get the Cambridge University one-page sustainability answer. And he came back with a blank piece of paper and a pen, and he said, there you go. So I wrote a slide, and I gave it to him, and he said, oh, it's pretty good. And anyway, I won't say what happened after that. But I basically focused in on 4 issues, and I'd like to just sort of bounce them off you, because to me, they're 4 fundamental issues. They haven't interrelated a lot to this point, but I think increasingly going forward they are going to interrelate. And I think we need to be thinking about action on all these fronts. The first is obvious, and I think is centre of plate for you guys, which is temperature. Temperature is suddenly rising too fast, and it's going to go to an equilibrium way above where we are today. It's a place where the world has been before, and the world is quite happy to sit at that level, and it takes a very, very, very long time to unwind from that position. The unfortunate thing is that we can't survive at that level, and we're unlike, in many respects, we're going to have serious problems surviving even over, well, put it this way, it was said to me that in the 50 to 70 year window, the climate of Darwin would be unlike any place on Earth at the moment, for example. So it's going to be real radical change real soon. But that's the path that the world is on. It's, as I said before, it's a slow cycle, it's slow to reveal, but the way in which we're influencing that rise is accelerating, not decelerating. Despite everything we talk about, coal consumption rises, renewables take a bite out of the growth, but they don't take a bite out of the stock. And technologies that might save us, like carbon sequestration and things like that, are not really realistic at this point. The second is biodiversity, and we're clearly living through a mass die-out of species. And many of the drivers of that are things like land use, population growth, and the like. But as we get onto the steep part of this temperature curve, then that is clearly also going to become a factor driving the loss of biodiversity. And biodiversity is really, really important because it makes the system robust. If the system is experiencing change and you have biodiversity, some species fall away, others come forward and take over, and we're more likely to preserve something that we recognise. Attenborough made a really interesting point. It goes to, when he was here in Australia last, it goes to one of Tony's slides that he flashed up. He said, I started working for the BBC in 1954. He said, I'm still working for the BBC. He said, in my working life, the population on the planet's gone from 2.5 billion to 7 billion. Just in his working life. It's an incredible invasion. But he and Darwin both said Australia has an enormous responsibility on the biodiversity front. The ABC said recently that 50% of the biodiversity loss in the world in the last 20 years has occurred in Australia. Because so much of what Australia has is so unique. And so you don't know what it is in that loss of biodiversity that could be fundamentally important going forward. We have, as a nation, 17 biodiversity hotspots that are not well known, and the management of which is really quite haphazard. It's not very well coordinated, as it is in fact across the world. So the second big issue then is biodiversity. The third is food. We've already seen a couple of food crises. The Arab Spring basically came out of a food crisis, the failure of the Russian wheat harvest. And the system is increasingly vulnerable. Again, the focus on monocultures. You've got water issues emerging all over the world. You've still got a population rising on its way, predicted to be 9 billion There's also emerging crises in what I call the 4 Ps, potassium, potash, phosphates and phosphorus, many of which have very severe potential supply constraints and which underwrite the productivity of agriculture. So with a rising population, with water in many parts of the world becoming a problem, and with the factors that underpin agricultural productivity at risk, we are going to have, at the very least, a substantial increase in the costs of food, let alone the availability. And when that becomes a crisis, you're going to be dealing with migration of people at a level way beyond what you're seeing today. So there are 3 that are probably pretty obvious, and I am comfortable then fitting other things like land use, water, the nitrogen cycle under those. And as I say, to me they're quite separate to this point, but they will get woven together as we go forward. The 4th one is sort of slightly out of that genre, and that is the issue of inequality. All the time we live in unequal societies, and I'm not a complete communist. So most of my life is a capitalist. And so I do believe in reward for effort. You know, you can have a tilt like this in a society, or you can have a tilt like that in a society. And the problem is when you have a tilt like that in a society, the problem isn't a shared problem. Right? It's not felt the same. These people can insulate themselves from the effects, and they have the resources to capture the political class, and so nothing happens. And inequality exists at 3 levels in my mind. One is at that societal level. The second is the inequality between nations, and you saw in Copenhagen how the Western world balked at the amount of compensation the emerging world wanted for not going down the same path. And that's an issue of inequality, and it not being a shared problem. Again, the Western world will not feel the effects of the food crisis in the same way as Sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan being uninhabitable, etc. And then the third and the real hidden inequality is intergenerational inequality, which many people don't even measure or talk about. How the way we live, not just environmentally, but the way we live with a debt overhang, with social contracts that we can't afford to fund and so forth, create a burden for the next generation. The house prices we enjoy, the average age of new home buyers is going up about 6 months every year, for example. Those sorts of inequalities between the generations are very, very substantial and largely hidden. So countries like Sweden and Norway that actually have a decent rate of income tax have a lower tilt. The academics measure at the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile of wealth. And Australia's right out there towards the US. Sweden, Norway, Japan are at the other end. They're happier, they live longer, and they are acting on some of these issues. And I'm pleased to see that the Chinese say the model they're most interested in the long run is the Swedish model. They meant that economically, not any other way. So let me come back to the role of business then. And I agree completely with Jeffrey that the board of directors needs to be thinking longer than a CEO. They appoint the CEO, they fire the CEO. Their job is to protect the institution in the long term. They need to understand the risks to the robustness of the business model that the company operates, and they need to be prepared to adapt, and they need to be prepared to come together and be a progressive voice and tell the politicians what they want to manage our economy onto a more appropriate path. Otherwise, just like I learned this afternoon, guns managed to achieve, they're going to just turn themselves into the next generation. Anyway, that's where my thinking is at.
Thank you. Philip Sutton. I just wanted to, speaking about being cheerful, I want to throw in a comment briefly, which is that at the moment a couple of speakers have said we've got a certain amount of temperature rise built in. That's only built in under a scenario. In other words, that temperature isn't there now, and CO2, while it could create that temperature, later, needn't create that temperature if the CO2 is not there in the future. So in other words, the scenario for a safe climate future is still zero emissions take the excess CO2 out of the air, and if necessary use direct cooling, i.e. solar radiation management as a temporary measure. But there is a way to actually turn this thing around, and I'm getting increasingly worried in our community that we've become so pessimistic, we're actually acquiescing with the disaster that's unfolding.
Well, I agree with you. It would be fantastic if we could turn it around, and it does as it comes to innovation. But you don't read much debate about that. You read much more debate about adaptation to what's changing. In other words, it's inevitable. How do we adapt? How do we cope? Rather than how can we, hold the line and go back. So I agree that it's still a possibility, but less and less focus in my
We're trying to
reading.
be the leaders, so we need to actually lead on that possibility.
Fantastic. If anybody has a technology that can hold the line, that would be fantastic.
Sue? Over here.
Thanks, really enjoyed your talk. The question I've got, you spoke about woolly mammoths in our brains and our inability to think longer term and to think about things that are just so broad ranging. And a lot of work we talk about in the climate debate is in those terms. I'm just wondering, is there another way of doing this? I'm from the water, part of my life is in the water industry, and there were individual decisions that were made by a community which resulted in a 40% reduction in water. So I'm wondering, rather than talking about big change, global macro issues, why don't we turn it around the other way and start talking about, and this is what I can do, this is what then my community can do.
I think that's right. So there's partly a communication issue of making it tangible for people. There's a little sign on Bondi Beach that says by 2050 the water level will be here, and people look up to it and they look at it and they go, well, that's not going to affect me, I live in Liverpool. So the problem is that's not the whole issue right there. But one of the things I learned recently was how the economics of solar and battery have crossed the line of the economics of grid distributed electricity in Australia. And grid electricity, the cost is predicted to double in the next 5 years. So there will be a point where Australia begins to decommission, I think, the electric grid, which, again, people have just tipped 35 billion, which I wouldn't like to see. I think it would be fantastic if we could get a trophy project like taking Ballarat off the grid, just to prove that it could be done and bring forward that tipping point, which would then have a cascading effect, because when you take volume off of a fixed cost infrastructure like that, then they have to recover elsewhere, and then get the run-on effect. So I would like to see things like that that would actually make it tangible for people.
Thank you very much. Given your previous role with JB Weir and...
No, it's now previously. Now.
Oh, sorry, someone was with JB Weir.
No, that's where I am now.
Oh, I apologise. And echoing Michael Douglas and as Gordon Gecko, the greed is good. Weiser and Zadak did a paper in 2000 that talked about return on assets, return on sales. Return on equity was 9.8% higher for built-to-last companies, 63.5% higher total return on shareholder equity. Why is Australian businesses, fund managers, boards so slow to pick up on the sheer economic return that can be achieved through sustainable business practices? Have you got any reflections on that?
Well, there's a huge legacy investment in the old way of doing things, I would say, first of all. Secondly, there's been wavering on the policy front. Are we taxing carbon? Are we not taxing carbon? Are we supporting wind? Are we not supporting wind? And these things create, I think, an uncertain environment for people to invest against. So I think people are quite cautious about cutting away from what's working and is delivering returns and stepping out into new territories. But, as I've shown, there are competitors in even state industries, like I mentioned the New Zealand example, where people are prepared to get out there and experiment and try and flip their incumbency into the new world, but they're really the exception, not the norm. And what Larry Page said is right. Most companies will fail to anticipate the future.
There's a very large trucking logistics company that's saving $25 to $28 million per annum on their total energy spend.
Well,
I just don't know why other companies.
Well, the bank
aren't
did
doing
that as well. I mean, the bank went to carbon neutrality and started to put pressure on suppliers and help customers and things like that. So, so you can make baby steps that contribute, and I think that's good. And there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on. But in my mind, that's not enough, and that we need some more top-down